Evening, everyone. So yes, thank you. We should have sound. I thought I would talk about sort of conference season. Of course, I had a little talk about the way. I mean, last week the way the Lib Dems. I think, I think the Lib Dems and the SNP are have stood out to me as being the parties that have, or the opposition parties certainly, who've really told their members what they need to do at the next election in a way that's absolutely truthful. The Conservatives are not doing this at all. But actually, Reform UK. Now, I've been reading some reports of some of the stuff coming out of the Reform UK conference. Now, policies aside, which of course are all massive cons, Nigel Farage and Richard Tice, I mean, we'll focus on Nigel Farage because he's obviously given the most important speeches. I would say Reform UK seem to have a bit of a plan for the next election. And that could be quite interesting because, let us say, so, you know, whenever we're looking towards the next election, I know it's quite mad. We were looking towards this election. As soon as this election's over, all of a sudden looking to the next election. But we are still in fairly interesting political times. And we keep thinking about Labour's chances in the next election and, you know, that being dependent on the Conservatives. Can they sort themselves out or not? Can Labour deliver enough to persuade people that, oh yes, things have turned around here? Because Labour keep talking about the decade of renewal, but in actual fact, we're not talking 9 years of not a lot happening, then everything all of a sudden comes to fruition in that 10th year. So we're talking about things before the next election being significantly better. So will Labour do enough of that to persuade people? But the reference point is going back to, I suppose, 2001. So the last time Labour came back to power, 1997, and stayed in power. So you're trying to look at, so where did the Conservatives go wrong between 97 and 2001? Where did Labour go right? And you're looking for the same sort of things. But we have this huge difference this time. We have Reform UK. They were not about 1997 to 2001. Not even UKIP were, you know, a force then. Were they even existing? There were Brexity type parties. I can't remember if UKIP was one of them or not. I forget when they came into view. But you think to yourself, if, like, I keep thinking, right, okay, if Labour starts to improve people's standard of living, that should cut the feet from out of Reform UK. But there's also an extent to which their base arguments will constantly appeal to some people. And if they can persuade people that they are at least a better bet than the Conservatives, then you actually think to yourself, they could cause even if the Conservatives did start to, you know, be a bit more professional, they could cause them trouble. And I'll tell you some of the things that's been said at this conference. Actually, I've got the wrong thing here. I'm writing some bits down. So the first thing Nigel Farage has said, well, it wasn't necessarily the first thing he said, but the first of importance is that they need to be credible. Now, Zia Yusuf, who's the Reform UK Party chair, he was made chair after the election. So I don't know that he had much involvement. I suppose he would have had some, but he wasn't the party chair during the election campaign. This happened afterwards. And he has been saying that actually the Reform UK manifesto, they called it a contract, but the Reform UK manifesto contained a lot of stuff that wasn't really credible. And he said that at the next election, they have to make their policies more credible, more believable, more deliverable. And Nigel Farage has sort of said the same thing at the conference. So then you start to think to yourself, that's actually quite interesting because someone was saying, I think UKIP was founded in 1993. Yeah, but yeah. When did they start to become a force? Though I forget. I can't remember. Gareth there saying UKIP were about in 97, got very few votes. James Goldsmith, I remember Goldsmith. He had the that's right. The referendum party were because they were the ones cheering off. He stood against Michael Portillo, didn't he? When was it? Stephen Twigg won for Labour. That was the big thing there. But anyway, so you think to yourself, okay, so Reform UK are now talking about forming credible policy. Because I always say that the issue is they can always outbid the Conservatives by coming up with policy that they don't have to be totally, they don't have to be deliverable. Now, you think to yourself, if they start making their policies credible, does that mean that it makes it easier for the Conservatives to bid with them? I would still say no, because you can make your policies credible without being deliverable. Because some things, all they have to do is sound like they might work on paper. Because all Reform UK need is for the mainstream media to look at their next manifesto or contract, whatever they want to call it, but if they want to be serious, they may as well call it a manifesto, to look at their next manifesto and go, okay, this adds up. And plenty of people can say, but we don't think it's deliverable. Well, that's a matter of opinion, isn't it? So that can happen all the time. I mean, smaller parties do that all the time. The Green Party do that. The Lib Dems do that. They'll come up with it. As long as you can't say there's anything wrong with the way it adds up, you might look at it and go, oh yeah, but if you implemented it, you'd have this and this. And you could go, well, that's a matter of opinion, isn't it? So Reform UK can definitely do that. Oh, Gareth saying David Mellor's who Goldsmith stood against. Oh, is it? Okay, I'm misremembering then. I'm going to have to go and check back who, because I'm sure there was someone from that party or a Brexity party. We didn't call it Brexit then. Who was there at the Portillo result. I'm going to have to go back and check now. Anyway, you may be right now that I think about it. Yes, David Mellor sounds familiar now. But anyway, so that the next thing Nigel Farage was talking about as well, which again, Zia Yusuf, the party chair, has also been talking about. So the need to get grassroots support. You know, Yusuf was saying the problem they and I said this, didn't I? Before the election, the problem Reform UK have is they don't have boots on the ground. They're this top-down model. They get themselves on the big names, Nigel Farage, Richard Tice. They get themselves on the telly, so they get themselves out to lots of people in the country. There's no one knocking on their door. There's no one talking to them face to face. It's all just that message. So, whereas people will have been knocking on their door from Labour, the Conservatives, the Lib Dems, the Greens. And so what they want to do is they want Reform UK activists out on the streets. In order to do that, they need to build up a grassroots network. You can't do that at the moment because they don't have members. So then that's why they're talking, you know, Nigel Farage says he's going to give up his shares and he's going to put the members in charge of the party. We will have to see exactly how that works. I'd already mentioned in a video this week, one of the there's not many detailed policies that I've seen reported yet. One of them is in order to trigger a confidence vote in the leader, you would either need 50% of the members to request one, in which case it's utterly pointless, because if a majority, I mean 50%, it's not, you need one more than that for it to be a majority. You're basically talking a majority to meet. You will never have that. The other one is if 50% of Reform UK MPs, but there's only 5 of them, and you would actually need 3 of them therefore to make 50%. And Nigel Farage is probably not going to vote against himself, and neither is Richard Tice's mate. So in actual fact, you'd need all of the others to do so. So basically, this new rule would mean that the leader will be absolutely safe. So it remains to be seen how much say the members really get. But here's where there's a double-edged sword, because they clearly recognise that if they want to build up local parties, local Reform UK parties, to go out door knocking, then they're going to need to give members the impression that they are part of the party. And how do you do that? That means having to give them a bit more influence. But it's a double-edged sword. You give members a bit of influence, they use it to actually cause as many problems as they help with. You see that in any party, but in Reform UK, remember, by definition, if you support, I know it might sound terribly arrogant of me, but I'm going to say, if you support Reform UK, you're not well informed. I'm just going to say that. You're not well informed. So it's a double-edged sword. You've got people who are more politically naive than most. and plenty of party members of any party are politically naive. But then they said something else, and this is like, well, this depends on what you're doing now. Because then they talked about focusing. Now, the reality is, if you look at the election results from this year, Reform UK overtook the Green Party as the most inefficient party with parliamentary representation in Britain. I've not worked this out for any of the Northern Irish parties. But... So you think, because they're going about, oh, we've got 4 million votes, 4 million votes. Yeah, that's a hell of a lot of votes. That's a distressingly high number of votes. But they're spread all over the place. And this is what I kept saying for months ahead of the election. It was far back as last year. I kept saying, I think Ed Davey was doing a really good job with the Lib Dems because he was completely focused. Instead of the Lib Dems just trying to have this mass appeal, like the Green Party still do, have this mass appeal and base their success on how many votes they get, they said, no, we want to win seats. And so they completely ignored the sort of issues, political issues, that might have won them support, but in places they had no chance of winning. And they completely focused their messages on the seats they were targeting. And do you know what? They won all but one of their target seats. And at the next election, they could potentially target more. So Nigel Farage was saying we're going to target seats. He says we're going to focus on where we came second. And you think to yourself, okay, that strictly as he's saying it, that won't work. Because I just dug up a couple of examples before we went live. Let me pick out a couple here from the election. So, I just randomly picked these. I didn't go down a list of which the most likely. I wish I had an Excel. I'm going to have to make one, but it's going to take a long time. I was hoping to find an Excel spreadsheet of all the general election results. Can't find one. But Normanton and Hemsworth, right? Midlands. And, oh no, this is West Yorkshire apparently, sorry. So Labour won, and they won with just over 17,000 votes. And Reform UK came second with about 10.6 thousand votes. Now you look at that and you can go, okay, you could try and push for a seat like that. You could try and push for a seat like that. If you can persuade people, if you've got a ground operation there, because remember, they did that. Reform UK came second with 10,500 votes there won't have been a lot of door knocking going on in that area. There really won't have been a lot of door knocking going on. So if you can build up yourself a bit of a network, a bit of a member network, and you can get people out to knock on doors every day for the whole of it leading up to the election and during the election, if at least, let's say, 5 days out of 7 in every week, you've got a team of people in Normanton and Hemsworth going out, knocking on doors for Reform UK, you can probably get some extra votes there. And if you don't lose too many, and let's say you can persuade people that Labour aren't actually delivering, oh yeah, it might be a bit better, but it's a bit rubbish, you could see that seat maybe being targetable. But then you look at another seat where they came second, Bootle, Liverpool. So they came second there. They got 4.7 thousand votes. The Labour winner got 26.7 thousand votes. You're not targeting that seat. So it really depends. What they'll need to mean is not that they're going to target the seats where they came second. They'll need to target the seats. Actually, in some seats, they may have come third and could still target it. They need to target the seats where, one, they can actually build up a decent glut of members to get that door knocking team out there, and two, where the number of votes is achievable. But there we go. Right, go through some comments here. It says, does Neanderthal hold constituency surgeries? As far as I don't actually know, to be honest. I can believe he would, because for him, he's the only Reform UK MP that's not just some bored millionaires. The rest of them have all got their normal. That's his job. In the case of Leanderson, I mean, okay, he does GB News. Does he still do that? Is he still on GB News? I haven't heard otherwise, so I assume he is. So he does his GB News gig like once a week. Other than that, he is an MP. So he will turn up to Parliament I can believe he probably does do constituency surgeries, because for him, that's a lot of money. He's getting his whatever 90 grand roughly, I can't give or take, for being an MP, and that's that. So he appreciates that money, so he'll do the work for it. Whereas for the others, for all of the others, for Lowe, for Tice, for Farage, the other guy, sorry, I've forgotten his name. That's the MP's salary is neither here. In fact, Rupert Lowe, he doesn't even take it, does he? It doesn't. He doesn't even take his salary, presumably because it would cause him tax trouble, although he's trying to make it sound like it's he's being charitable. But it just shows how much money he's making from his own businesses. In fact, what it shows is that the salary for him is neither here nor there. It's peanuts. So I can believe that Anderson probably does do his work, because he will still want to carry on being an MP. If he was to suddenly stop being an MP, he has his pension, and it might well amount to about 10 years worth by the time this Parliament ends, but he would still rather keep his MP salary, I think. Brad said there, Farage said bigots not welcome, he should be rewarded an Oscar for just saying that with a straight face. Well, exactly. I mean, if you take away all of the bits about what Reform UK stand for and stuff like that, which is all a complete grift. But what I'm saying is, if you look at what he's been saying about how they're going to approach the next election, I'm going to say this. They are actually saying the right things. Whether they do them is another matter. But if you were to say, what would Reform UK have to do to actually improve their standing at the next general election? Not in terms of votes won, but in terms, or share the vote won, but in terms of seats won, then you would say they need to turn themselves into a proper political party, because they're going to need that large army of volunteers to go out door knocking. It's a hard, thankless task. My absolute admiration to people who day in, day out are able to do that. Obviously, only so many people are able to do that. You're mostly talking about people who are retired or don't have, if they do work, there's not a lot they do with their free time. There's only so many people, although fortunately Reform UK do attract the elderly voter. That's one thing you would need to do. The other thing you would need to do is to stop having your policies attacked so easily in the mainstream media. So you at least need to make the figures add up. Now, if it doesn't mean they have to be realistic, because if anyone says, oh, we don't think this would work, you could say, well, that's supposition. We think they will. As long as because the easiest way to pick fault with a manifesto is say these figures don't add up. As long as the figures add up, everything else is fine. And then the other thing you would do is to target seats where you can realistically win. And they have actually said they want to sort of model themselves a bit on the Lib Dems, because here's the other thing. The other gambit they're playing is they're claiming that they can actually win the next election. Now, of course, they can't. That's ridiculous. And it's actually quite funny. So they reckon they're going to copy what the Lib Dems do and have successfully been doing for decades, with a little bit of a wobble about 10 years ago. And but somehow they're going to form a government on the back of it. But at the same time, you could argue that that is also an important part of their strategy, because, I talked about the fact that this year, anyone voting for Reform UK was not voting for the government. Now, some people may have believed they were, but not many are that stupid. So what they want to do is to attract some people who can at least think that they are a better bet than the Conservatives. Although the irony is that in order for Reform UK to really prove to people that they can have a proper tilt, they'd actually have to threaten an awful lot of Labour seats, not just Conservative ones. But anyway, Rob there saying about Reform splits the vote, giving Labour and Lib Dems a unique opportunity. See, that's where you've got a bit of that's where I have an uncomfortable feeling about this. So there was I've forgotten where I was reading it now. There was a report in the last week I was reading, which I sort of knew anyway, but to read it's uncomfortable. And it is the idea that Labour basically made very little effort to counter Reform UK during the election campaign. There was no real effort for Labour, and this is true, of course, there was no real effort for Labour to call out Reform UK or Nigel Farage. And the reason for that was strategic, because they knew that Reform UK were costing the Conservatives way more votes than they were costing Labour. Which, in a first past the post system, especially, I mean, you could argue it would have held true in a PR system as well. But certainly in a first past the post system means that Labour stood to gain a lot more seats. And I think someone worked out that Labour may have gained 60 to 70 extra seats because of Reform UK. In other words, Labour would have won their majority. Although I would argue there's another spanner in the work here, because remember, a lot of people didn't vote for Labour what would have done. It was like they had to be certain that Labour were going to win and then put their vote elsewhere. I suppose without Reform UK, the polling would have been less conclusive and maybe more people, but you know, that's speculation. And the same will of course be true of Lib Dems as well, as you say. So at the next election, you have this other thing as well, like, will Labour and the Lib Dems do the same thing? Not just focus on the Tories and not Reform UK? Because as long as that's assuming it's still the same. I mean, obviously, if Reform UK are going to like reform themselves and fundamentally change the way they do a lot of things, maybe at the next election they present just as much of a challenge to Labour as the Conservatives, at which point Labour will then be forced to have to call them out a bit more. But if we assume that they're going to continue to appeal more to Tory voters than Labour, or traditional Tory voters than to traditional Labour voters, then the situation becomes the same. Labour focus on denouncing the Conservative policies on record. The Lib Dems do the same. And the Tories are looking from side to side, having to work out how to deal with Reform UK and how to deal with Labour and how to deal with the Lib Dems. So yeah, arguably, if Reform UK sort themselves out, I'm not at all a happy bunny about this, but if Reform UK, and it sounds from the conference like they're at least identifying what they need to do, they could cause the Tories huge problems. And if you imagine, like if you go back to 2001, the Conservatives won one extra seat compared to 1997 was a big loss for them, like not as big as this one, but it was at the time massive. And at the following election, they made it was a net gain of one seat, because I don't think it was actually one. I think it may have been lost one and gained a couple or something, but it was a net gain of one seat. So not very good. They didn't actually improve at all over those 4 years. Well, if the same thing happens, and they're given every sign of it, if the Conservatives don't start to repair their reputation, and I see no sign of it at the moment. I mean, if you look at what they've got, you've got Robert Jenrick, who's leaning into the Reform UK light. He's going, and he's been involved in some pretty... When we've been reading in the news about Keir Starmer getting some free glasses, what you've not been reading about, unless you follow Tortoise Media, is the fact that Robert Jenrick has accepted a massive donation from, well, who knows? There's no real record of where it's come from. It's dodgy as hell. It comes from a business that doesn't look like a real company, because it's got like no assets or anything like that, and no staff or anything. It doesn't do anything. So it's like a shell company. And it's like, so where's the money from? I mean, that's what really should be in the news. If that were Labour, that would definitely be all over the news. And also he's been going on about recently this English identity, which I don't even know what that is. And then you look at the alternative, like James Cleverly, and he's still talking about, he's banging on about immigration. I've got this plan for immigration. It's like, well, why didn't you put it in place when you were Home Secretary then? Like, what? Like, who does that? as a home set, and he's trying to claim that it was actually successful because he reduced immigration by 40% or visa applications by 40%. It's like, yeah, the visas we wanted people to take up, you idiot. But anyway, Pune said, I don't see how the Tories could fix their rep, at least with younger generations. Everyone I know my age hates Brexit, but they're wedded to it. Generation Z, by the way. Even amongst more middle-aged, I mean, we know younger people tend not to. I still want to, I'm still waiting to find out what the actual demographic breakdown was of votes. I'm still curious to see as what proportion of the voters were at which ages. I haven't seen that yet. But we can probably guess that younger voters probably not that big. Although because the overall, I don't know, we'll see. But generally younger voters tend not to be well represented. So we're talking about those older ones anyway, but they've lost the older ones. But, you know, really in a situation where Reform UK, I still think they're going to lose pragmatic support by all, because literally for a lot of, there are some Reform UK voters who are totally sold on their like grift. But there are some of them who just, their attitude is just, look, the life's crap. They think to themselves, because they believe the Tories, that Labour left us in a mess. And then they looked, well, the Tories didn't make it any better, did they? They made it worse. So in them, there's a lot of people in their minds, neither Labour nor the Conservatives have the answers. So they turn to Reform UK. Whereas if Labour actually do show, oh no, we do have a lot of these answers, some of them will naturally peel away from Reform UK. But it doesn't mean that Reform cannot attract new voters. Maybe because there were a lot of Conservative voters who maybe thought Reform UK were the better party, but they voted pragmatically because the Tories had no chance. Well, if it still looks like the Tories have no chance, maybe they will switch to Reform UK. So, you know, you can see, I mean, although I talk, you know, with certain things happening, there is a certain path through this Parliament that leads to Reform UK not winning any MPs at the next election. Because if Labour do deliver, I don't know that they'll ever deliver on immigration in a way that those sort of anti-immigration people will feel they are doing. Because at the end of the day, how do you deliver? As far as they're concerned, you can only deliver by basically having no immigration, right? Which would be catastrophic. So that's not going to happen. But you can make the NHS work better. You can improve housing, although, you know, that'll take more than 4 or 5 years. But you can improve the situation with housing. You can improve, you know, people's prospects in the workplace. You know, Labour are already setting us on a path towards, workers, on a path towards getting above inflation pay rises at last. And of course, much improved workers' rights, which has been, someone said at the start, actually, what we're going to be looking at the Labour conference this year. Arguments, I think, is the thing. Is it Labour's job to be more upbeat? I do think Labour need to be more upbeat, yes. But mostly what this conference will be about is keeping a lid on arguments. Because the thing is now, you would think everyone would be really happy in Labour. Oh, you were in power, brilliant. But no. Because now that Labour are in power, the onus is on to get it right. And because lots of different people have lots of different ideas about what getting it right looks like, and they're all really desperate for Labour to get it right, lots of arguments. So actually keeping a lid on the arguments is the #1 job at this conference. But I do think being a bit more upbeat. There we go. Richard there saying, Phil, I need a rant about the BBC and their hypocrisy around this Starmer gift shindig. They failed on dozens of occasions to report, say, Hester getting government contracts after donations, etc. Well, I mean, if we come back to Robert Jenrick, so Robert Jenrick, as a housing minister years ago under Boris Johnson, famously was given a meal, back when he liked his meals, he was given a meal by a property developer, and in return for just a meal, he helped this property developer get out of £45 million worth of taxes. So he robbed the Treasury, helped this guy or legally, so I suppose I can't say rob. Should we say deny the Treasury £45 million in taxes? And then what happened? Or is it, hang on, am I over-egging it? Is it 40? It's probably something stupid like 45,000. Hold on. I had it written down somewhere. Where was it? I was looking at it earlier today. Probably still got a little note of it because I may bring it up. No, it was. It's 45 million. I wasn't over. Yeah, it was 45 million pounds in taxes. And you know what? This property developer who in giving Robert Jenrick a free meal got out of 45 million pounds in taxes. Do you know what he then did? He gave the Conservative Party a donation, right? Afterwards. So Robert Jenrick had to do the deed first. There was none of this, I'll give you a donation in return, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. It was always, right, you scratch my back first, then I'll scratch yours. So he gave the donation afterwards, so it's corrupt as hell. But here's the thing, if there's any Americans in the chat, this will blow you away. So he saved 45 million, right? Now that's his company, admittedly, so how much he personally saved, I don't know. But it would have been, he owns it, so quite a lot of it would have been his. So he saves 45 million. What do you think the donation was to the Conservative Party? It was £12,000. That's how cheap it is to corrupt our government. The government will help you fiddle the Treasury out of 45 million pounds, and in return you'll say thank you very much, here's 12,000. The whole thing just is utterly ridiculous. And you know, and was there, and don't get me wrong, I think the way Starmer and Labour in general have approached this sort of accepting gifts thing has been politically naive. It's actually quite weird because they've now said they're not going to accept any more clothing gifts, and it's like the clothing gifts were not an issue. There's some other things which are more of an issue, arguably. The clothing gifts are absolutely not. But here's the thing that gets me. Why are they saying, well, we won't accept them in the future? Why don't they say, okay, if you don't like it, we'll just change the rules? Why are they hamstringing themselves? David, they're saying £12,000, we know about that. I don't get why Labour are hamstringing themselves by saying, well, we won't accept clothing gifts then, but still allow the Conservatives to. No, why don't they say, okay, if the public really don't think this is acceptable, we hear you, we'll change the rules. It's like, I don't understand how, I mean, don't get me wrong, that, you know, in terms of like politically weird decisions and behaviours, this is nothing like with Rishi Sunak. I mean, the level of political incompetence there was off the scale. But it's still, I mean, it's a bit weird. Anyway, never mind. Phil there saying the development did not go ahead in the end, did it not? But at the end, but still, I mean, he still fiddled it so that he could have saved £45 million in taxes. I'm going to have to look it up now. But either way, Robert Jenrick still did that. And there was some, I mean, I know about it because there was some reporting, but there wasn't a lot. They certainly didn't go for like 2 weeks in a row. Why do Reform UK seem to be more popular with economic left-wing but socially conservative red wall voters than Tories when they're more right-wing? Because they did things like say, we're just going to raise the income tax threshold to £20,000. So at the moment it's, I forget exactly, it's about 12,500. So that's what you can earn before you pay any income tax. So they say, well, we'll put it up to 20,000 without, you know, any credible way of saying how they would afford to be able to do that, because that would lose a lot of tax. But they things like that, because, you know, you say to people, well, we'll raise the threshold so you won't pay as much income tax, and they think, oh, that's good. We won't pay as much tax. It will save money. And in a cost of living crisis for people on low wages, actually, you know, I mean, how much would that? What's the low rates? Oh dear, my brain's going to fail me. I better do it on Excel or something. Let's get an Excel open. So I'm going to work on the assumption it's about 12,500. I think it's about that, near enough anyway. So that'd save you about 1,500 quid a year. That's over 100 quid a month. That'd be a lot of money. That would be a lot of money to someone who's on at least £20,000 a year, should we say? So let's say to someone who's on about 20,000. Now they were never getting that. If Reform UK had have won enough MPs to form a government, that policy would never be put in place because they couldn't afford it. Or if they did do it, they'd have to do something to basically, rob Peter to pay Paul. They'd have to load up they'd have to like double VAT or something like that. Capital gain threshold's now £3,000. Yeah, 12.6 thousand, 0.8 I think is the current threshold, but it's about 12.5. So that's what it would save a lot of money. So it's things like that. That's how they appeal. Because there are a lot of people in this country, like a lot of people underestimate it, who are economically left-wing in that they want the rich to pay their fair share of tax. They want public services to be properly funded and work. Well, mostly what they want them working, right? But they sort of understand the government needs to run that. But they're also quite anti-immigration, quite parochial, really. Quite authoritarian, in terms of dealing with criminals, we lock them up. So yeah, so that's all Reform UK had to do. They already had these people on the immigration and being tough with criminals. Farage was at it again today, using the Hugh Edwards thing, saying, oh, how come you can be sent to prison for calling someone a paedophile, but not if you're an actual paedophile? And it's things like that he will absolutely ruthlessly exploit. And so all he had to do was pretend that he was also going to improve public services and, let people basically have more money, people who are struggling, to get rid of the cost of living. Because I'll tell you what, if you did raise the income tax threshold to £20,000, oh yeah, for people on low wages, that would be a massive bonus. Why are Labour not freezing the cap on domestic fuel prices or even reducing it? Two good reasons. I don't know, obviously I don't get invited to their meetings, but I would say two good reasons. The first of which is obviously that the Conservatives already baked it in. So if Labour were to prevent it going up, and I will grant you it's a slightly dodgy one. It's a little bit dodgy because obviously that is something that does hit ordinary working people. However, Labour did say they wouldn't be increasing. This is where it's playing a bit fast and loose. They said they wouldn't increase taxes on ordinary working people. And you think, well, fuel duty will do, won't it? And they will probably argue, but that was already put up by the Conservatives. It just hadn't been implemented yet, but it was already factored in. And if they were to stop that, they'd have to find the money somewhere else, in all honesty. But then there's another problem as well, in terms of fuel duty in general. I did actually write a video about this, a script about this some time ago. And then it was going to be a video that just wouldn't have got that many views. Did I actually put it? I don't think I put it out in the end. And then when we sort of got hit with the people who've just been turned off politics recently, I thought I'll just save it for the future. But fuel duty is going to run into problems because the idea of fuel, I mean, we know that taxes raised don't automatically translate into certain spending, but we think about fuel duty as raising the money needed to maintain roads, right? Now, and even fund the development of new roads, but, to fund and maintain the road network. However, there's going to be an increasing number of people using electric cars. They're not going to pay any fuel duty. They'll pay VAT on the electricity they use to charge the car, but as it costs way, way less to charge your car than it does to fill your tank, with the same mileage worth, should we say, then and of course you pay VAT on fuel as well as fuel duty. So the actual intake from fuel duty is going to come down quite a lot. Oh, domestic fuel, not petrol. It's the same thing, isn't it? As in the same duty, is it not? But that's ultimately the problem. You're already going to have lower tax revenues coming in from fuel duty because people aren't going to use it as much. In fact, they're not going to use it as much in the home either, because new builds are going to increasingly be having solar panels and heat pumps. So doesn't road tax pay for the maintenance of roads? Again, it's not enough. I mean, there's all of these things that in theory are supposed to contribute to it, but not enough. And also you'd pay lower road tax on an electric car as well, because road tax is based on emissions. Don't really have emissions with an electric car. Let me have let's have a quick look, because I don't actually know the amounts. So electric cars don't actually have, no, they don't pay road tax. Oh, Jamie Mack saying that EV car tax has been introduced. Yeah, it needs to be. I mean, that's the same. That they're going to need to do that because at the moment, I mean, Labour are pushing towards emissionless transport, or at least the emissions don't come from the transport itself on the roads. So you're going to have to replace a load of taxes. Yeah, Adam's saying no such thing as road tax. Yeah, but we know what we mean when we call it that. And in actual fact, the obvious solution to it is something that at the moment is politically impossible. It's another example of how the Tories and Tory media are like tying our hands behind our backs, because the obvious solution to replacing something like, fuel duty, replacing road tax, is pay per mile. Don't forget the showroom surcharge. EVs are lots of money. Yeah, but only so much of that ends up at the Treasury, doesn't it? So yeah, it's and whatever you pay for it is, I mean, it's quite interesting to compare the running life, or should we say 10 years? 10 years is a reasonable amount of time. If you buy a new car, you're probably not going to keep it for 10 years, but someone will at least. So if we compare how much it costs to buy and run an electric car with an equivalent type of car, but that's like petrol transmission, then that would be quite interesting. Road tax should revert to what it was before there were emission considerations. Well, yes, Wendy. I mean, the thing is, the idea of basing road tax on emissions was to encourage people, or really it was to encourage manufacturers to produce cars with lower emissions. But as soon as you're insisting on that by law, which is not quite the case, yes, but in a few years' time, as soon as you've already put that in by law, then yeah, there is absolutely no benefit in tying road tax to emissions. Or you could have a separate one. You just have, I mean, sorry, who was it now? Someone just said they're going to introduce a separate one anyway. So you just create a separate one there. One Angry Pagan saying land tax is needed. Yeah, I am a huge supporter of that. If I was to be able to get to champion one tax reform, it would be land tax. I am fully sold on the idea. Absolutely. Sorry if there's adverts thrown up there. Paying tax on tyres would be an effective pay per mile while also encouraging better driving. No, I mean actual pay per mile. That would actually make more sense, because it would get people, it would actually help reduce congestion as well, because it would get people to think about, like, people, there are some people, if you're on a really, really tight budget and actually filling your car up is really expensive and you can't always afford it. I had a mate once who would, it wasn't all the time, but every now and then would just run out of fuel in their car because they could only afford to put a fiver in at a time. And, but, so people like that, yeah, they're going to not make unnecessary journeys because they already know that the cost. But if you're someone, and you don't really think about the cost of petrol. If you did, if you were to work out, because a lot of people don't actually sit down and audit themselves, do they? Not many people sit down and really work out what they're spending. So all they're really doing is trying to work out what's left in the bank to make sure they need to know when their direct debits go out, and other than that they're just looking at the rest of it and keeping it going till the end of the month. But you know, if you were to say to someone it's going to cost you this much per mile, so if you know that going out is going to cost you money, which you know it does anyway because you're using petrol, but people don't think of it like that, but they would with pay per mile. So then people would think, well, I don't need to drive to the shops, I'll just walk. You know, if it's the local shops, I'm only going to get a pint of milk, I'll just walk. So it would actually help to reduce congestion, I think. So pay per mile would actually be a good policy. But, of course, because the Tories and the Tory press did all this, oh, Sadiq Khan's going to bring in pay per mile, and then, oh, Keir Starmer's going to bring in pay per mile, and it got them all on the defensive. I mean, I don't think they were planning on it anyway, but because it got them on the defensive, it means that now it's just seen as this negative thing. When actually, you could make pay per mile cheaper than the equivalent duties for people who use their cars responsibly. But anyway, Daniel's saying, I can't afford an electric car. The government needs to make electric cars cheaper. Well, I don't think the government can do... Well, they can actually. I suppose they subsidise a bit. But they will... It's like everything else. They'll naturally come down. I mean, I can't at the moment. I don't think there's actually one I'd like at the moment either. But, you know, so there'll probably be one... I'll probably have one more car that's not electric, and then the one after that will be. But it's like everything. If you remember... You know, anything when it first came out was ridiculously expensive. Mobile phones were ridiculously expensive. DVD players were ridiculously expensive. Everything's expensive until it starts becoming more mainstream, and then all of a sudden it's a lot cheaper. Same thing will happen. Pranay say that my dad is a car fanatic, hates the idea of pay per mile, thinks we should abolish fuel duty and just raise income tax to cover it. Meaning people who don't drive supplement those who do. Well, exactly, that's the thing, isn't it? I mean, everyone would like that. Everyone likes the idea of sharing the costs of their activities more widely. Everyone loves that idea. You know, but in reality, it is politically better to tie the costs of things to the people who most use it. I mean, there are certain things where we shouldn't do that, like with healthcare and education. Like we shouldn't, for example, tax parents for being parents, because we want to encourage that. But there are certain things like road usage. There are people, like no one or very few people deliberately injure themselves. I mean, if they do, it's usually like because mental health problems. But very few people of sound mind deliberately injure themselves and put them into hospital. So, you know, there's no need to be punitive with taxation on healthcare. But there are some people who make journeys that they don't need to make. And, you know, if you need to drive to work, a lot of people need to drive to work. If you need to drive to go your grocery shopping, absolutely. Next week, I've drove to do some grocery shopping today. Next weekend, I shall be driving to the train station to go down to London for the Rejoin March. But I don't use my car to drive round to if I just need to pick up a couple of things at the local shop, the local shop for local people, I don't drive, I walk. It's only like 10-15 minutes. That's what I do. I don't drive into the high street to go to the doctors. I walk. It's 15 minutes. To the hairdressers, it's 15-minute walk. Viv there saying colour TVs were extortion. I can well believe it. In fact... Oh, I don't have it anymore. I did have the very first copy of PC Gamer. No, not PC Gamer. I did also have that. No, there was another one, a more general PC magazine. I've forgotten what it's called now. The price of the first PCs was and I didn't get one of the first PCs, by the way. First PC I ended up getting was a Pentium, but I was interested in computers. And price of computers is absolutely insane. In fact, the weird thing is, you can buy a computer now for the same price as it would have cost 30 years ago. In fact, for less. In fact, my first laptop, which wasn't much of a laptop, it was a bit of a brick, but it was very advanced. My first laptop, which was a good one, and when did I get it? It was about 1998, I seem to remember. I'd qualified as a teacher, not been long qualified as a teacher. 1998 it would have been. And it cost me just over £2,000, about £2,200, right? The laptop I now use costs £2,300, and that's also a bit of a beast. So in terms of the equivalent, like in terms of where it is in the hierarchy, it costs as much now for a computer as it did then. And obviously back then, if you take inflation into account, it cost way more. In fact, I'm going to work it out, because this is going to blow my mind. I don't know what I was thinking of, because it was a lot of money. I'd only just come out of university, really. I now need to look it up. So if I paid £2,200 for a laptop back in 1998, this is going to be horrendous. Now I'm going to compare it with last year, because I bought my latest laptop last year, not at the moment. So we'll go back to last year, to be fair. Wow. Over £4,000, just over £4,000. So to get what was at the time a good laptop, it had, I can't remember all the details, but it was like a Pentium 2. It had a DVD player in it. You could play DVDs, which I used it for, connected up to my telly. Played DVDs, DVD movers, as well as obviously game DVDs and stuff like that. It was a good one. It was big, but it was a good one. In today's money, £4,000. And now, the one I've got now, which is also a bit of a beast, although it doesn't have a DVD player, because you don't get those anymore, unless you really want it for some reason. £2,300. There we go. This is like one of those maths questions on an O-level maths exam, except we didn't have laptops then. No. You may, unless you were at the end of O-levels, you probably didn't even have a pocket calculator then, did you? You would have had log tables to deal with instead of a calculator. Don there saying ZX81 was $99, I think. Wouldn't surprise me at all. Spectrum's £130 in this country, apparently. I mean, yeah, so... Yeah. I don't know how we got onto this. How did we get onto this? It was my fault. I'm sure it was. But never mind. Right, let's carry on. I've derailed everything. Sorry, it's my fault. Yes. Oh, that was what I was explaining. I was explaining how costs come down over time for most things. Not for computers, they don't. But that's because with computers, they carried on getting a lot better. Whereas cars do get better, but not at the same rate. So yeah, electric cars will get a lot cheaper. In fact, actually, Don's just said £10 portable USB DVD player now. Yeah, so it's next to, but even actual just for a DVD player, you'll hook up, or Blu-ray player these days, that you'll hook up to your telly. It's what, 30 quid, 20 quid maybe. I haven't bought one for a little while. So the price of housing relative to salaries is much higher than 1990s. It is. Oh yeah, I quite agree that in terms of like disposable income, a lot of people struggle much more now. I agree with that. But nonetheless, the point is that you can get, you will see the prices fall. They'll have to. You know, as more people buy them, that will just have to be the case, because they'll need to be able to sell it to people. Andrew there said, trigger warning, log tables. I don't know though. I mean, at least with log tables, you're less likely to like make a mistake by fat fingering the old keys on the number of times I used to do my editing with students. I would say, when you've put when you've run something through your calculator, will you look at the number and see if it sounds plausible? The problem, however, when you're doing anything with logs, is the answer never looks plausible. So you always just have to do it twice. But the number of times students will just tap something into a calculator and go, oh yeah, that's, and just stick the answer down without ever thinking about it. Oh, so Johnny kicks that football 5 miles, did he? That's what he did. You thought that was the right answer, did you? Good one. Or probably 5 kilometres. Mark, they're saying 10,000 now for 5-year-old Nissan Leaf. A lot of people will be put off getting electric cars after a few years old, though. I mean, they're getting better and better, but the last thing you want to end up with is an electric car at the end of its life. People are talking about early computers now. This is all my fault. Don there say, the point was the UK has gone from a foot nation to too many cars nation from the industrial importance and thus primacy of course everyone needs a car or two. Well, I mean, yeah, I mean part of that of course will be deliberate. We've massively gutted public transport. Gutted public transport. So yeah. And I suppose some of it as well is not just that. Some, like for example, take grocery shopping. I mean, there was a time before everyone had a car. You know, your grocery shopping was going down the high street. You went into the greengrocers, then you went into the butchers, then you went into the bakers, then you went into the pharmacy. You know, and you did all these little trips to build up your local groceries. Whereas now we go to a supermarket, but supermarkets had to be built initially out of the way. They weren't allowed to begin with to be built in like residential areas for fear of the competition for the small businesses like the bakers and the butchers and so on. So that necessitated driving to get there if you didn't have a bus route. And if you did have a bus route, it was a big weekly shop, family shop, you weren't going to easily get it on a bus anyway. Will full self-drive help sort the excess cars on the road? So if we get to that in a reasonable amount of time, yes, I do. If it becomes, because a car is expensive, however you look at it, even if the price does come down. But if you can just like ring up like an Uber type thing without it being a crap business model and there's no person in it, then yeah, I think that would be useful for a lot of people. It would work out cheaper, wouldn't it? How long were cars in 1910 meant to last? I've no idea. I'm not a car historian, I'm afraid. Ned there saying, actually, I think once the skills filter down, I think old EVs will be fine. Compared to an ICE car, there's a lot less to them. Well, we will see. Jamie has just said there that Dad sold a 10-year-old Leaf. Battery was about 80% of initial range. That's quite good. Yeah. Matthew there saying most cities in Europe are so much more walkable than the UK. Well, I mean, my experience is only the cities, towns and cities I've been in, but I will actually say, if you're talking about like town centres, because there was a thing in the news this week, wasn't there, that Sadiq Khan's going to pedestrianise Oxford Street in London. And I don't think a big fuss was being made of it, by the way. But you just think, well, this is just, I mean, that's like normal. For towns and cities I've lived in, they're already pedestrianised in the centre. It's already pedestrianised. Like, you know, I can't... There's the odd city where there's maybe a road through, but a lot of it is already pedestrianised. But that doesn't necessarily mean, like, you know, where you live, a lot of, you know, not everyone lives in a city for walking to shops and things like that. A lot of people will, I mean, to be honest, the village I grew up in, which is a big village, it actually had 2 supermarkets. But where I live at the moment doesn't have any supermarkets. It has a convenience store. It has two convenience stores. And, you know, there is a greengrocers, there is a the butcher's quite good, actually. He does really nice pork burgers. And, you know, and he's really good if you want a specific cut of meat, as all butchers will be. And we've got a baker, of course. Although the bakery is a bit limited, I have to say. It's not really that good. if I'm honest. But you know, in terms of getting most of your groceries, you're going to you're either getting it delivered here, but the stuff that comes, we usually get a delivery each week, like online shopping, and then I will go in the middle of the week to get like fresh stuff, because if you get it from, and also even the stuff that's not strictly what you'd call fresh stuff, it still goes out. Like, you know, we're always finding stuff that's got dates on it like halfway through the week. I don't like the online shop. We only do it because my wife likes it. So that's, you know, so we forgot to do it this week. Accidentally forgot on my part because I never remind her. So that's why we went out today to do one lot, and I'll do another fresh round next week. Because do you know what? Even paying for some of the like the so-called finest stuff and stuff like that with fruit, like we got some grapes last week, and I was having some. So they arrived on like Saturday. And I was having some on Thursday, a couple of days ago. And some of them are mouldy already. And they've been in the fridge. It's absolutely crap. I don't like Brexit. I hate it, in fact. I very rarely say I hate anything. But anyway, Viv there saying, I grew up in Bristol, used to walk everywhere. We walk where I live now. Flats, lots of shops, supermarkets. Only drive the car outside of town. Well, the only thing I use my car for, and it is always out of town because everything's out of town, I drive to when I go to my local gaming club because it's not really local; it's in another town. There's nothing around here. And when I go to the supermarket, and of course I'll be doing it to go to because there's no train station where I live. So to get to the train station to go to London next week. So that's the sort of thing. I don't really drive habitually, and I don't drive around the place I'm in. If I'm, you know, if they're 15-minute walk away, I walk 15 minutes and 15 minutes back. But there are a lot of people who don't. There are a lot of people who will just get in the car. And yeah, I think pay per mile would just focus people's attention a bit. And also it means those who use the roads more will pay more. Now, I will grant you it's not always as simple as that, because you might argue, for example, I don't know whether this is true or not, but it might be true. You might argue that there are some people on some of the lower wage earners maybe have to travel further for jobs. So maybe you end up with a situation where some people on the lower incomes have to do more commuting in a car. I don't know whether that's true or not. It may or may not be. So you may have to look at things like that. But there we go. Imagining you in a gaming club playing D&D. I haven't played D&D for years. I play Warhammer these days. Focusing on the politics of the world your group is in. Yeah, I haven't actually played D&D. I wouldn't do that, though, I have to say. When I'm gaming, I behave myself with politics. I sometimes have to bite my tongue, but I do behave myself. But there we go. Richard there saying, I walk to work only 15 minutes quicker than drive. Well, that's, you know, and that's, but there's a lot of people who do have to drive a fair way. I once had a job that was a 125-mile round trip each day. That was quite extreme, though. But anyway, we've gone over time. We'll have to leave it there. I don't know how we ended up going from Nigel Farage to... actually, I do know. It's my fault. To driving. But there it is. Thanks for coming on, everyone. Have a great rest of evening. And until next time, I'll see you later.